For centuries, a single word spoken after your first name could quietly reveal more about your ancestors than a family portrait ever could. It hinted at the church they served, the faith they defended, the monastery that sheltered them, or the beliefs that forced them to flee their homeland. In some places, it even determined whether neighbors welcomed your family or watched them with suspicion. Today, those same surnames appear on driver's licenses, business cards, and school diplomas, carrying histories that most people never notice. Yet, hidden inside countless family names are echoes of forgotten pilgrimages, medieval monasteries, religious reforms, persecution, and remarkable acts of devotion. The mystery is that many descendants have no idea they're carrying these stories every single day. A surname was never meant to be just a label. Long before governments issued identification documents, communities depended on names to understand exactly who someone was. Occupation, birthplace, appearance, family connections, and religious identity all found their way into the names people inherited. In deeply religious societies, where faith influenced nearly every aspect of daily life, a surname often reflected spiritual life just as much as family history. That tiny clue became part of a person's identity long before anyone imagined genealogy websites or DNA tests. Religion shaped medieval Europe in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Churches were not simply places of worship. They controlled education, preserved written knowledge, managed charities, settled disputes, and often advised kings. Monasteries served as centers of learning, agriculture, and medicine. Pilgrimages stretched across continents, drawing thousands along dangerous roads in search of healing or forgiveness. Entire villages revolved around feast days and religious festivals. When faith occupied such a central place in society, it naturally left fingerprints on people's names. But those fingerprints did not all form in the same way. Some surnames honored saints. Others described someone who worked for the church. Many reflected families who lived beside monasteries or cathedrals. Some quietly revealed conversion to a different faith, while others preserved memories of religious persecution that forced entire communities to relocate. The deeper historians dig, the more these names resemble tiny historical documents rather than simple family labels. One of the most recognizable examples appears almost everywhere in the English-speaking world: bishop. Today, it sounds perfectly ordinary, yet centuries ago, someone carrying this surname likely had a close connection to a bishop's household. Rather than holding the office itself, bishops ranked among the most influential figures in medieval Europe. Their authority extended far beyond religious ceremonies. They owned land, advised monarchs, oversaw courts, and sometimes commanded military forces. Families serving a bishop's estate often earned reputations tied directly to that relationship. Over generations, neighbors identified them by the powerful church official they worked alongside. Eventually, that description became permanent. The descendants of cooks, scribes, stable hands, administrators, or trusted servants inherited a surname that quietly preserved their family's connection to one of Christianity's highest offices. Yet Bishop tells only one version of the story. Many surnames reveal ordinary people whose lives revolved around parish churches rather than grand cathedrals. Clark, or Clark, for example, traces back to the medieval word clerk, referring to someone who could read and write. Literacy itself was closely associated with religious institutions, because monasteries and churches educated much of Europe's literate population. A clerk often copied manuscripts, maintained records, or managed correspondence for religious authorities before expanding into secular administration. This connection surprises many people because today's office clerk seems far removed from monks illuminating manuscripts by candlelight. But language preserves remarkable journeys. A modern surname can quietly remember centuries of scholarship rooted in religious education, even if its owners have never stepped inside an ancient monastery. The trail becomes even more fascinating with surnames connected to saints. Across Europe, parents frequently name children after beloved saints, believing the heavenly figure would offer protection throughout life. Those first names gradually transformed into hereditary surnames. Martin, Thomas, Nicholas, James, Patrick, and Lawrence all owe much of their widespread popularity to Christian devotion rather than coincidence. Take Martin. Its extraordinary spread across Europe accelerated after Saint Martin of Tours became one of Christianity's most admired figures. A Roman soldier turned monk, Martin famously cut his military cloak in half to share with a freezing beggar. According to tradition, Christ later appeared wearing that same half-cloak, praising Martin's compassion. His reputation spread across the continent, inspiring churches, villages, and countless families to honor him through naming their children. Eventually, Martin became one of Europe's enduring surnames. But the story grows even richer because different regions adapted saintly names into countless local forms. Johnson literally means son of John, connecting indirectly to one of Christianity's most significant names. Ivanov traces the same root through Slavic traditions. Giovanni evolved into Italian surnames like Di Giovanni. In Spain came Hernandez and Fernandez through similar naming traditions surrounding Christian first names. One original religious inspiration branched into hundreds of hereditary family names across continents. Still, not every religious surname celebrated prestige or popularity. Some preserve memories of extraordinary hardship. During the late Middle Ages and early modern period, religious conflict reshaped Europe with astonishing force. Entire communities fled because their beliefs differed from local rulers. Protestants escaped Catholic territories. Catholics fled Protestant regions. Jewish families faced repeated expulsions from kingdoms where they had lived for generations. Religious minorities often carried names that reflected both their heritage and the places where they sought refuge. The French Huguenots offer one remarkable example. Following increasing persecution during the 16th and 17th centuries, thousands fled France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 stripped Protestants of many legal protections. Families scattered across England, the Netherlands, Prussia, Switzerland, and the American colonies. Many retained distinctly French surnames despite generations abroad. Others gradually adapted spellings to fit new languages while preserving their original identities beneath the surface. A surname passed down today may quietly record an ancestor's desperate journey across Europe in search of religious freedom. The spelling alone can hint at that dramatic chapter, even if the family story itself faded long ago. But persecution was hardly limited to one faith. Jewish surnames reveal another remarkable historical journey. For centuries, many Jewish communities relied primarily on patronymics rather than permanent hereditary surnames. Governments across Central and Eastern Europe eventually required standardized family names for taxation, military service, and administration during the 18th and 19th centuries. Some surnames reflected occupations. Others described places. Many referenced Hebrew religious traditions. Names such as Cohen, Katz, Kaplan, and Levy frequently point toward ancient religious roles connected to the temple in Jerusalem. Cohen derives from the Hebrew word for priest. According to Jewish tradition, Cohen trace their lineage to Aaron, brother of Moses. While modern genetics cannot confirm every individual family history, researchers have discovered fascinating patterns among many men identifying as Cohen, suggesting that at least portions of these traditions may preserve surprisingly ancient ancestral connections. It represents one of the rare occasions where history, religion, linguistics, and genetics intercept in unexpected ways. Levy similarly reflects descent associated with the tribe of Levy, whose members traditionally fulfilled important religious responsibilities. These names carried immense spiritual significance long before they became common entries in census records or immigration documents. The real surprise emerged centuries later when millions of immigrants carried these ancient religious identities across oceans. At Ellis Island and other ports, officials recorded names that had survived empires, exiles, and revolutions. While pronunciation shifted and spellings evolved, many religious connections endured beneath Americanized forms. A family adapting to life in New York or Chicago often unknowingly transported centuries of sacred history inside a surname that now appeared completely ordinary. Christian religious orders left equally lasting marks. Consider surnames like Abbott or Abbott. Few modern families descend directly from abbots themselves, because abbots generally belong to celibate monastic communities. Instead, these names usually describe people employed by an abbey, living on monastic lands, or resembling an abbot in some memorable way. Medieval villages frequently grew around monasteries, creating generations of workers whose livelihoods depended upon religious institutions. These abbeys functioned almost like self-contained towns. Farmers cultivated monastery fields. Blacksmiths repaired tools. Bakers supplied bread. Shepherds tended flocks. Scribes copied manuscripts. Travelers sought shelter behind monastery walls. The surrounding population often became inseparable from the institution itself. Their surnames quietly preserved that connection long after the monastery disappeared. England alone lost hundreds of monasteries during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. Buildings crumbled, libraries scattered, and religious communities dissolved. Yet countless surnames continued carrying memories of places erased from the landscape. Another unexpected group of surnames points toward pilgrimage. Throughout medieval Europe, pilgrims traveled astonishing distances to holy destinations such as Jerusalem, Rome, Canterbury, Compostela, and countless local shrines. Completing one of these journeys demanded enormous sacrifice. Roads were dangerous. Disease spread easily. Bandits targeted travelers. Many never returned home. Those who completed especially famous pilgrimages sometimes earned lasting reputations within their communities. A returning traveler might become known simply as Palmer, because pilgrims to the Holy Land traditionally brought home palm branches as evidence of their journey. Over time, Palmer evolved into a hereditary surname found across English-speaking countries today. Without realizing it, some modern Palmers may carry the memory of an ancestor whose greatest achievement was surviving one of history's most demanding religious expeditions. Elsewhere, surnames emerged from geography closely linked to sacred places. Families living near churches, chapels, crosses, monasteries, abbeys, or shrines often acquired descriptive names tied to those landmarks. Cross, church, kirk, temple, chapel, and Kirkpatrick each reveals subtle relationships between local geography and religious life. Kirk, common in Scotland, comes from the old is also common in Scotland. Cross-cleaning, seed, spirit, heaven. Peyton, Kristen, and saddle. Temple sometimes recalls land once associated with the Knights Templar or other religious institutions. Church frequently identified families residing beside the village church rather than working inside it. These names remind historians that faith shaped physical landscapes just as much as personal beliefs. Then, there are surnames, hiding religious meanings beneath entirely different appearances. The Irish surname, Kilpatrick, originates from the Gaelic Kilfodrick, meaning the Church of Patrick. Kilbride points toward St. Bridget. Kilmartin remembers St. Martin. Across Ireland and Scotland, the prefix Kil often marks places where early Christian churches once stood. Entire communities preserved ancient places of worship through names that still exist hundreds of years later. Most fascinating of all is how these names survived waves of conquest, language change, and political upheaval. English rule transformed spellings. Immigration altered pronunciation. Census takers misunderstood unfamiliar accents. Even so, echoes of the original religious landscape remain visible for anyone willing to look closely. Yet another layer of history appears during the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther challenged established church authority in 1517, Europe entered an era of enormous religious transformation. Families sometimes adopted or abandoned certain names depending on political and religious circumstances. Regions embracing Protestantism gradually favored biblical first names directly from Scripture, rather than names associated primarily with later saints. This subtle cultural shift influenced future surnames because patronymic naming continued for generations. Biblical names like Samuel, Daniel, Benjamin, Jacob, and Isaac spread widely in Protestant communities, eventually producing hereditary family names that reflected changing religious preferences. A surname could therefore hint not merely at Christian identity, but at the theological currents shaping an ancestor's society. Historians rarely mention another fascinating detail. In some regions, governments deliberately encouraged standardized surnames, partly because religious authorities needed accurate parish records. Churches recorded baptisms, marriages, and burials long before national civil registries existed. Priests carefully documented family relationships, creating some of history's most valuable genealogical archives. Stable hereditary surnames made these records increasingly reliable. Modern family historians owe an enormous debt to generations of clergy who diligently maintained parish registers, often through wars, epidemics, and political turmoil. Without realizing it, millions of people searching family trees today rely upon religious record-keeping traditions established centuries ago. Of course, a surname alone never tells the complete story. Migration complicates everything. Marriage changes family lines, spellings evolve, different surnames sometimes developed independently despite identical appearances. Two unrelated families sharing the same surname may possess completely different histories. Conversely, branches of the same family often ended up with dramatically different spellings after crossing borders. Genealogists therefore treat surnames as clues rather than conclusions. They combine church records, census documents, wills, land deeds, immigration files, military archives, and increasingly DNA evidence to reconstruct forgotten family histories. The surname opens the first door. The real journey begins afterward. That careful approach has produced remarkable discoveries. Some families believed their names reflected occupations until parish records revealed connections to medieval monasteries. Others assumed their ancestry was entirely local before finding evidence of refugee ancestors escaping religious violence centuries earlier. In countless cases, forgotten migrations resurfaced because one unusual surname prompted someone to ask a simple question. Where did this name truly come from? The answer often reached far beyond anything they expected. Modern genetics has added another fascinating chapter, without replacing traditional history. DNA testing occasionally supports ancient migration patterns suggested by surnames, though it cannot determine religious belief itself. Faith leaves cultural traces, not genetic markers. Yet when DNA evidence aligns with historical records and surname origins, researchers sometimes reconstruct family journeys spanning 1,000 years. That combination of science and historical documentation continues transforming genealogy into one of today's fastest-growing historical pursuits. Perhaps the greatest surprise is that religious surnames belong to every major faith and nearly every civilization. Islamic naming traditions preserve connections to pilgrimage, scholarship, tribal heritage, and devotion. Hindu surnames often reflect priestly roles, temples, or religious communities. Buddhist societies developed naming customs tied to monasteries and regional traditions. Jewish, Christian, Sikh, and countless other cultures likewise embedded spiritual identity into family names in unique ways. Although the details differ, the underlying idea remains remarkably consistent across humanity. People have always carried pieces of their spiritual world within their names. That realization changes how we read history. A surname is no longer just ink on a birth certificate. It becomes evidence, a surviving artifact, a tiny historical record passed from one generation to the next without anyone needing to preserve it intentionally. Some names remember saints who inspired entire nations. Others recall monks copying manuscripts while kingdoms collapsed outside monastery walls. Some preserve journeys made by exhausted pilgrims crossing mountains in search of forgiveness. Others quietly remember refugees who abandoned everything except the family name they refused to surrender. Centuries passed, kingdoms disappeared, religious movements rose and fell, languages transformed beyond recognition, cathedrals burned, monasteries vanished, borders shifted countless times. Yet millions of surnames survived it all. Every introduction at a family reunion, every classroom roll call, every signature on a mortgage or passport may contain fragments of forgotten belief, sacrifice, courage, and survival, stretching back hundreds of years. Most people will never notice, but once you understand how deeply religion shaped the history of names, it becomes almost impossible to look at any surname the same way again. The greatest family heirloom is not always hidden in an attic or locked inside a museum. Sometimes it has been spoken aloud for generations, carrying the quiet memory of ancestors whose faith shaped their world long before anyone thought to write their stories down. If your family name has a story worth discovering, subscribe for more forgotten history.